Welcome to the debate. Today, we are stripping down one of the most enduring, expensive, and paradoxical institutions in human history, the Olympic Games. It's a tradition that, it claims to be a suspension of hostilities, a fortnight where the world lays down its weapons to pick up javelins. But when you look at the actual source material, from the ancient festivals in Olympia around 500 BCE to the multi-billion-dollar mega events of Beijing and Vancouver, you really have to ask, does the reality actually match the rhetoric?
That is the essential question, isn't it? We're looking at a timeline that spans millennia, but the core tension, it remains the same. My reading of the history suggests that the Olympics aren't a celebration of human unity. They're a mirror. They don't fix our geopolitical fractures, they magnify them. I'm the dissenter, and I'm arguing that the Games are and have always been a high-stakes theater for political posturing and nationalism.
And I am the advocate. And my position is that while the political noise is, it's undeniable, the Games successfully function as a unique mechanism for peace. Despite the boycotts, the propaganda, and the commercialism, the Olympic ideal, that vision Pierre de Coubertin had in 1894, it actually works. It forces the world to talk, even when they don't want to.
Forces the world to talk is a very generous way to describe what usually happens. But let's start with that foundation. You bring up Coubertin. He's usually painted as this starry-eyed idealist who just wanted everyone to run in shorts. But looking at the actual historical record, the revival of the Games was messy from day one, wasn't it?
Messy, perhaps, but effective. You have to contextualize the late 19th century. Nationalism was surging across Europe. Borders were hardening. And yet Coubertin managed a diplomatic miracle. The first modern games in Athens in 1896 didn't just appear out of thin air. He brought together 14 nations. Now, 14 sounds small by modern standards, but getting Germany, France, and Great Britain to convene in Greece for a sporting festival, that was unprecedented. It established a baseline of international cooperation that simply didn't exist elsewhere.
I'll grant you the novelty of 1896, but let's look at what followed. You argue that the Games are a mechanism for peace, but the timeline suggests they're a magnet for conflict. The ideal is consistently hijacked. You can't talk about the unifying power of the Games without addressing the Cold War. It wasn't a time of friendly rivalry, it was ideological warfare played out in tracksuits.
But they were competing. That is the crucial distinction. Even in the deepest freeze of the Cold War, they were on the same track.
But were they really together, though? Look at Helsinki 1952. The Soviet Union participates for the first time since the Russian Revolution. Do they mingle? Do they exchange pins? No. They refuse to stay in the Olympic Village with the capitalist countries. They built a separate camp. The Soviet officials viewed every gold medal not as a sporting achievement, but as empirical proof that the socialist system was genetically and socially superior to the West. That isn't unity. That is war by other means.
It was tension. Absolutely. I'm not denying the friction, but consider the alternative. Without the Games, those nations have 0 points of contact. The Games force interaction, and sometimes that interaction breaks down barriers in ways diplomacy cannot. Fast forward to the Sydney Games in 2000. We saw athletes from North and South Korea marching together under the same flag. That is an image, a physical manifestation of hope that decades of UN sanctions and treaties failed to produce.
It's a powerful photo op, I'll give you that. But does a march change policy? I'd argue these moments are exceptions that prove the rule. If you want to talk about interaction, we have to talk about Melbourne, 1956. This is the blood-in-the-water match.
I had a feeling you'd go there. It is the counter-argument everyone reaches for.
How could I not? It's the ultimate refutation of the peace narrative. This was water polo, USSR versus Hungary. You have to set the scene. This is happening immediately after the Soviet invasion of Hungary. The tanks were literally rolling in Budapest, crushing the revolution, while the athletes were in the pool in Australia. It wasn't a game. It was a brawl. It was so violent the water turned red. The officials had to abandon the match because the players were physically assaulting each other. That is the reality of bringing hostile nations together. The conflict follows them into the arena.
And often, individual humanity overrides the state-sanctioned hatred. You mentioned the blood in the water, but let's look at Berlin, 1936. This is the ultimate test case. Hitler explicitly intended those games to prove Aryan superiority. It was set up as a propaganda masterclass.
Which it was. We still use Leni Riefenstahl's footage as the gold standard for how to shoot sports and how to shoot propaganda.
The footage is one thing. The result is another. Jesse Owens, an African-American athlete, enters that hostile environment and wins 4 gold medals. 100 meters, long jump, 200 meters, relay. He didn't just win, he dismantled the entire premise of the Nazi ideology simply by performing. If the games didn't exist, Owens doesn't get that stage. The ideal allows for the meritocracy to embarrass the autocracy, and the crowd in Berlin, they cheered for him. That's the nuance people miss. The German people recognize the excellence even if their leader didn't.
I think we romanticize the Owens story to make ourselves feel better about the fact that the world effectively legitimized the Nazi regime by showing up. But let's put a pin in the nationalism aspect for a moment, because there's another layer to this ideal that I think is equally fraudulent: the concept of fairness and who actually gets to compete.
You're referring to the amateurism debate?
I am. The source material highlights this repeatedly. The fair play narrative crumbles when you look at eligibility. It has been cruel, inconsistent, and frankly classist. The most egregious example has to be Jim Thorpe in Stockholm 1912.
That was a complicated situation.
It wasn't complicated, it was hypocrisy. Jim Thorpe wins the pentathlon and the decathlon by massive margins. The King of Sweden shakes his hand and says, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." And then what happens? They strip his medals. Why? Because he had been paid a pittance, room and board basically, to play minor league baseball one summer. Meanwhile, you had wealthy aristocrats competing in equestrian or fencing who didn't need to work, so they fit the definition of amateur. The rules were designed to keep the working class out.
I won't defend the treatment of Thorpe in 1912. It was an injustice. But the institution is capable of self-correction. Thorpe's medals were returned to his family in 1982. It took too long, yes, but it happened. And more importantly, the games evolved. The transition to open competition, allowing professionals, was a necessary admission that the amateur era was flawed. By the time we get to Barcelona 1992 and the Dream Team, we finally stopped pretending. Having Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird there didn't ruin the Olympics. It elevated the standard of play to where it belonged.
It elevated the ratings, certainly, but it also proved that fairness is a flexible concept depending on what's profitable.
I disagree. It's about inclusion. If you want to talk about the evolution of the games, look at the trajectory of women. In Paris 1900, women were a token presence, restricted to ladylike sports like golf and tennis. But the momentum of the games pushed societal boundaries. Look at London 1948, Fanny Blanker's Cone. She was a 30-year-old mother of 2. The press called her the Flying Housewife.
A condescending nickname if I ever heard one.
Perhaps by today's standards, but in 1948, she won 4 gold medals. She proved to the world on a global stage that motherhood and elite athletic dominance were not mutually exclusive. That changes perceptions. And it keeps expanding. We saw women's weightlifting introduced in 2000, the steeplechase in 2008, and we cannot ignore the Paralympics, starting in Rome 1960. The Games have redefined what an athlete looks like, whether it's wheelchair rugby or visually impaired skiing. That is the Olympic ideal in practice. Ever-expanding inclusivity.
I will grant you that the optics of inclusion have improved, but I want to circle back to your earlier point about peace. You claim the Games reduce tension. I'd argue that the very structure of the Olympics, organizing everyone by nation, waving flags, playing anthems, inflames nationalism. It doesn't dissolve borders, it reinforces them.
National pride is inherently negative, though. It can be a celebration of identity.
It is, when it turns into propaganda or violence. We talked about Berlin 1936, but look at Mexico City 1968. 10 days before the opening ceremony, you have the Tlatelolco massacre. Students were protesting the exorbitant cost of the games while the country was in poverty. They felt the money should go to social programs, not a stadium. The government crackdown killed hundreds. And did the IOC stop? Did they reflect? No, the games went on. The ideal provided a cover for a regime to wash its hands of blood and put on a happy face for the cameras.
You are picking the darkest moments to define a century-long institution. You have to look at the broader picture, which is one of reintegration. Look at Tokyo 1964. This is less than 20 years after World War II. Japan was still seen by many as a pariah state, but hosting the games, building the Cathedral of Sports, allowed Japan to re-enter the global community. It was a moment of healing. The world came to Tokyo not as occupiers, but as guests.
Or it was a rehabilitation of image funded by taxpayers to make everyone forget the war crimes. And frankly, the behavior inside the arena often mirrors that hostility. Did you see the note on Beijing 2008? The Cuban Taekwondo athlete, Angel Velodia Matos?
That was an extreme case of individual misconduct.
He was disqualified and he physically kicked the referee in the face. That isn't peaceful coexistence. That is nationalism making people irrational. And speaking of irrationality, let's talk about the cost. Because if the political cost wasn't high enough, the financial cost is ruinous. This brings us to the commercialization of the ideal.
Well, the games are a massive logistical undertaking. They require funding. You can't host the world on good intentions alone.
Funding is a polite word for greed. The modern Olympics are a corporate franchise. The turning point was Los Angeles 1984. It was the first privately funded tournament. You had 30 sponsors. ABC paid $225 million for TV rights. Suddenly, the schedule wasn't determined by what was best for the athletes. It was determined by what suited primetime television in New York.
And thank goodness for that. You have to remember the context. After 1976, nobody wanted to host the games. Montreal 1976 was a financial disaster. The city was paying off that debt for 3 decades. The Big O Stadium was falling apart and became a joke. The Olympic movement was on the verge of bankruptcy. Los Angeles 1984 proved the games could be solvent. It saved the institution.
Solvency is one thing, selling out is another. Look at Atlanta 1996. The Coca-Cola Games. The commercialization had seeped into the actual competition. There were reports that they altered the track schedule specifically so Michael Johnson could attempt the 200-meter and 400-meter double. That is manufactured drama for ratings, not pure sport.
But what drama it was. Michael Johnson won the 400 meters by a massive margin, the largest in a century, and then ran the 200 in 19.32 seconds. That performance was superhuman. Without the commercial viability, without that TV deal, you don't get the global reach. Athens 2004 had 3.9 billion viewers. That reach is what allows a child in a remote village to see Abebe Bikila winning the marathon barefoot in 1960 and think, I can do that.
Bikila ran in 1960, long before the commercial explosion. You can't credit corporate sponsorship for him.
But the legacy is sustained by that model, the archive, the storytelling. And when managed correctly, the money does good. Look at Barcelona 1992 again. It wasn't just a sports event. The revenue allowed for the complete revitalization of Catalonia. They built infrastructure that the city uses to this day. It proves that the games can leave a positive physical legacy, not just debt.
If managed correctly is the biggest if in history. But let's look at the ultimate failure of the ideal. We cannot have this debate without discussing the moment the peace was shattered permanently. Munich, 1972.
It was a tragedy of unspeakable proportions.
It was a massacre. Palestinian terrorists broke into the village and killed 11 Israeli team members. The sanctuary of the Olympic Village was violated. And what was the IOC's response? A 34-hour pause, a memorial service, and then Avery Brundage, the IOC president, orders the games to resume. The games must go on. Many people found that decision grotesque. It prioritized the show over the human cost.
It was a controversial decision, yes, but I view it as an act of defiance. If they had canceled the games, they would have handed a victory to terrorism. They would have said that violence can stop the world from gathering. By continuing, they said, we mourn, but we will not be broken.
That is a very convenient interpretation for the organizers who had broadcast schedules to fill. But it opened the door for the games to become a political weapon. Look at what happened immediately after, the era of the boycotts. 1976 Montreal, 22 African nations boycott because New Zealand is allowed to compete after playing rugby with apartheid South Africa. 1980 Moscow, the U.S. leads a boycott over the invasion of Afghanistan. 1984 LA, the Soviets boycott in revenge.
For 3 straight Olympiads, the global participation was a lie.
Those were dark years, I admit. The boycotts were a failure of leadership. But notice what happened. The Games survived. The boycott era ended. By Beijing 2008, we had 204 nations participating. That is more members than the United Nations. Even during the height of the Cold War tensions at Seoul 1988, the US and the USSR were back competing. Participation is valued over isolation.
Participation is valued because the contracts require it. I remain unconvinced. When I look at the history, from the chaos of St. Louis 1904, where the Games were a sideshow to a World's Fair and half the athletes got lost, to the militarization of Beijing, I see the ideal as a useful myth. It's a mask for nationalistic ambition and corporate profit. The medals are just currency in a geopolitical trade.
I think that is too bleak a reading of the human spirit. You are looking at the structure and missing the spirit. The endurance of the Games proves their value. The flame has been relayed since 1936, passing through hands and lands that disagree on everything else, yet they agree on this one thing.
A flame tradition started by the Nazis for the Berlin Games, I might remind you.
A tradition that transcended its origins. That is the point. The humanity outlasts the politics. I want to leave you with one final image from the source material. Nagano, 1998. The Austrian skier Hermann Maier.
The crash.
The crash. In the downhill, he launches off a jump, flies through the air horizontally. He looked like he was skydiving without a parachute and crashes through 2 safety fences. It looked fatal. It was horrific. And yet, 3 days later, he is back on the mountain. He wins gold in the Super G. Then he wins another gold in the giant slalom. That resilience, that isn't politics, that isn't commerce, that is the raw human capacity to overcome. Or the act in Turin, 2006, where a Norwegian coach gave a spare ski pole to a Canadian rival, helping her win silver while his own team lost.
It's a nice story. And I admit, we watch for the crash and the triumph. But we must never forget that the stage upon which that happens is built on very shaky, very expensive, and very political ground.
Perhaps that tension between the ideal and the reality is exactly why we can't look away. It's a human endeavor with all the flaws and brilliance that entails.
On that, at least we can agree. It is a spectacle of humanity, for better or for worse.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We leave it to you to decide if the 16 days of competition justify the cost and the conflict. Until next time.